Imagine pulling a woolen cloak around your shoulders in the 13th century. It did not come from a roaring factory nor from the rattle of iron machines. Instead, every thread was spun by hand, every weave guided by wooden looms and the patient rhythm of human labour. Days, sometimes months, passed before cloth emerged from simple fibres. How did medieval weavers, without modern technology, transform raw wool, flax or silk into the fabrics that clothed an entire world? In medieval Europe, cloth was more than just material for clothing. It was the very fabric of daily life. From the simplest homespun tunic worn by peasants to the embroidered silks adorning kings and bishops, woven textiles surrounded every layer of society. Cloth kept bodies warm through harsh winters, signalled wealth and status in courts, and even held spiritual meaning when transformed into altar cloths, vestments, or banners for processions. The demand for textiles shaped entire communities. In villages, families spun and wove for their own needs, but in towns, weaving became a profession, gathering artisans into bustling workshops. Cloth often served as a form of currency and trade, exchanged across regions and borders. Flemish wool, for instance, was so prized that it became a cornerstone of medieval commerce, linking farmers, merchants, and monarchs in a shared economic chain. Beyond its practical value, cloth carried symbolic weight. Laws such as sumptuary codes restricted who could wear certain fabrics or colours, ensuring that fashion mirrored the rigid hierarchies of medieval life. A rich velvet cloak or a finely woven linen veil instantly revealed one's social standing. For monasteries and cathedrals, textiles symbolized devotion, crafted with care and consecrated for the divine. Thus, weaving was not a marginal craft but a foundation of survival, economy, and culture. Every thread told a story of labor, hierarchy, and belief. Before weaving could begin, raw fibers had to be transformed into something workable. In Northern Europe, wool was the most common material. Flocks of sheep provided thick fleece, which peasants carefully sheared in spring. The wool was then washed in streams or troughs to remove grease and dirt, a task that demanded both patience and strong arms. Linen, made from flax, required even more effort. Farmers pulled the stalks from fields, soaked them in water to loosen fibers, and beat them until thin strands could be drawn out. Hemp followed a similar process, producing strong cords ideal for coarse cloth or ropes. Meanwhile, in wealthier circles, silk was imported along trade routes from Byzantium and later from Italy, prized for its shine and softness. Each material carried its own challenges. Wool needed carding, combing with wooden paddles studded with small teeth, to align fibers. Flax demanded retting and scutching, messy work that often left fields stinking of rotting plants. These steps were labour-intensive, often involving entire families or communities working together. By the time fibers reached the spinner's hands, they had already passed through countless hours of preparation. What might look like a simple thread was, in truth, the product of earth, animal and human toil, waiting for the loom to turn it into something lasting. Spinning was the heartbeat of medieval textile production, and it was almost entirely in the hands of women. Using simple tools like the drop spindle or later the spinning wheel, they transformed loose fibers into continuous threads. The drop spindle, a small weighted stick twirled between fingers, twisting wool, flax or hemp into yarn. It was slow but portable. Women could spin while walking, tending children or watching over animals. By the 13th century, the spinning wheel began to appear in parts of Europe, speeding up production, though it remained a luxury in many rural areas. Still, even with improved tools, spinning was laborious. To produce enough thread for a single garment could take weeks of constant work. The phrase spinster, once meaning simply a woman who spun yarn, later became a term for unmarried women, reflecting how deeply this task shaped female identity. The work demanded more than time, it required skill. Too much twist, and the thread snapped like brittle straw. Too little, and it fell apart into loose tufts. The spinner's fingers judged the tension by feel alone, learning through long practice to balance strength and softness. In medieval households, spinning was not merely domestic labour, but survival. Without yarn, no cloth could be woven, no family could stay warm. Every spindle's hum echoed across villages, a reminder of the quiet, endless rhythm of women's hands turning raw fibre into the foundation of society. Once thread was spun, the loom became the stage on which fibres turned into cloth. The most ancient design, the warp-weighted loom, stood upright against a wall. Long vertical threads, the warp, hung down, kept taut by heavy stones or clay weights. The weaver passed horizontal threads, the weft, back and forth with a shuttle, beating each row into place with a wooden sword. Later, horizontal looms became more common across Europe. These allowed tighter weaving, more control, and greater speed. Their structure was simple: a sturdy wooden frame, a set of heddles to lift alternate warp threads, and a beater to press the weft firmly into the growing fabric. When in use, the loom produced a steady rhythm: the thump of the beater, the swoosh of the shuttle, the creak of wood that became the soundtrack of medieval towns. Weaving was highly physical. It required strong arms to pull the beater, sharp eyes to guide the shuttle, and a patient mind to repeat motions hour after hour. Mistakes could ruin entire weeks of labour, forcing the weaver to undo and start again. In villages, looms stood in cottages occupying half a room. In towns, workshops filled with looms created a chorus of wooden echoes. Whether for family survival or market production, the loom transformed humble thread into cloth that carried warmth, wealth, and identity. It was, in many ways, the machine of the Middle Ages, powered not by steam or gears, but by human hands. At the heart of weaving lay the interplay between warp and weft. The warp threads, stretched tight on the loom, formed the backbone of the fabric, while the weft threads, carried back and forth by a shuttle, filled the gaps and created structure. The simplest weave, known as plain weave, alternated over and under, producing strong, balanced cloth suitable for everyday garments. More advanced weavers experimented with twill, where the weft passed over 2 or more warp threads before dipping under. This technique produced the familiar diagonal ridges seen in woolen cloaks or trousers, stronger and more flexible than plain weave. Patterns such as herringbone or diamond designs emerged from these variations, allowing even modest cloth to carry a touch of artistry. In wealthier circles, brocades and damasks appeared, woven with complex techniques that required multiple shuttles and often incorporated gold or silk threads. These fabrics dazzled in cathedrals and courts, worn by clergy and nobility as marks of prestige. Yet even the most elaborate cloth still relied on the same fundamental rhythm: shuttle passing, beater striking, warp holding steady. Weaving was as much mathematics as craft. The spacing of threads, the sequence of lifts, and the count of weft passes determined the final fabric. Skilled weavers held these patterns in memory, repeating them instinctively. Every finished piece, whether rough homespun or luxurious velvet, was a testament to human precision and patience. Once the cloth was woven, its journey was far from over. Medieval textiles were brought to full life through colour and finishing. Natural dyes drawn from plants, minerals, and even insects infused the fabric with meaning. Woad and indigo yielded shades of blue, madder produced red, weld gave yellow, and the rare cochineal or kermes offered a brilliant crimson reserved for the wealthy. Black, often difficult to achieve, symbolised dignity and authority. Dyeing was both an art and a science. Cloth was soaked in large vats over open fires, stirred with poles and fixed with mordants, substances like alum or urine that locked colour into fibres. The process demanded experience. Too much heat could ruin the dye. Too little would leave colours pale and uneven. After dyeing, cloth underwent fulling, where it was pounded and washed to remove oils and to tighten the weave. This step gave wool fabrics their characteristic strength and density. Cloth might also be brushed with teasels, a spiky plant, to raise a soft nap, or pressed under heavy boards to smooth its surface. The result was fabric ready not only for function but for beauty. A bolt of bright red wool, a deep blue cloak, or a golden-dyed linen tunic could transform the weaver's work into both necessity and art. These colours became part of medieval identity, marking profession, wealth, and even devotion, all drawn from the humble labour of earth, fire, and water. When we compare medieval weaving with modern textile production, the contrasts are striking yet strangely familiar. Today, vast factories house power looms that churn out miles of fabric in minutes, guided by computer programs that control every thread with precision. By contrast, medieval looms relied solely on muscle, patience, and memory. Yet the underlying principles remain the same. Warp threads stretched tight, weft threads carried across, patterns built through repetition. Modern weavers, even those working with advanced machinery, still follow the rhythm inherited from their ancestors. The shuttle's journey, now replaced by automated mechanisms, is the same motion once performed by a craftsman's hand. The heddles lifting threads in sequence echo the ancient warp-weighted loom. What has changed is scale and speed. A single medieval weaver might spend weeks creating enough cloth for one tunic, while a factory today can produce thousands of yards in a single day. Industrialization made textiles affordable and widespread, but it also stripped away much of the intimacy of hand production, the sense that each thread carried the touch of its maker. In recent decades, there has been a revival of hand weaving. Artisans and historians use traditional looms to preserve ancient knowledge, valuing the imperfections and individuality that machines cannot replicate. The comparison reminds us that while technology evolves, the essence of weaving, binding threads into something greater, remains timeless. Weaving was not just a household craft, it became one of the driving forces of medieval economies. In rural areas, families wove cloth to clothe themselves and pay rents or taxes in kind. But in towns and cities, weaving workshops flourished, employing dozens of artisans and apprentices. Guilds of weavers regulated quality, set standards, and protected trade secrets, ensuring that their cloth commanded respect in distant markets. Certain regions became synonymous with excellence. Flanders, with its fine woolens, supplied much of Europe. Italian cities like Florence and Lucca specialized in luxurious silks and velvets, exporting their products across the Mediterranean and into northern courts. The English wool trade, meanwhile, generated wealth that shaped the kingdom's fortunes for centuries. Textiles often functioned as currency. Bolts of cloth were exchanged for spices, metals, or horses, bridging economies across borders. Royal treasuries stocked not only gold and silver, but also storerooms filled with fabrics valued as highly as coin. The prosperity of entire cities rose and fell on the strength of their weaving industry. Merchants built fortunes, cathedrals rose from the profits, and wars were fought to secure access to sheep pastures or trade routes. Behind it all were the weavers, whose steady labour turned raw fibres into wealth. Thus, weaving was not merely a domestic necessity, but an engine of commerce, shaping medieval Europe's political and social landscape as powerfully as any crown or sword. The life of a medieval weaver was both humble and vital. In small villages, many worked inside their cottages, a loom often dominating the main living space. The clatter of shuttles and the creak of wood became part of household sounds, mingling with the cries of children and the crackle of hearth fires. Weaving was rarely solitary. Family members assisted with spinning, carding, or winding bobbins, making textile production a communal effort. In towns, professional weavers joined guilds, which offered protection, training, and a sense of belonging. Membership came with responsibilities, adhering to quality standards, paying dues, and sometimes even participating in civic defense. For ambitious weavers, guilds provided a path toward respectability, though true wealth was often reserved for merchants who sold the finished cloth rather than those who wove it. Their work was grueling. Long hours hunched over looms strained backs and arms, and poor lighting made mistakes easy. Yet skill brought pride. A well-woven fabric not only clothed the body, but also reflected the dignity of its maker. Weavers often balanced subsistence labour with artistry, infusing plain cloth with subtle patterns that hinted at beauty despite limitations. Whether weaving for survival or status, these artisans stood at the heart of medieval life. Their hands shaped the cloth that wrapped peasants in warmth, adorned nobles in splendour, and dressed priests at the altar. In every thread, the presence of the weaver lingered, even if their name was forgotten. Though centuries have passed, the legacy of medieval weaving endures. Many traditional techniques, plain weave, twill, tapestry, are still taught today, preserved in workshops, folk schools, and heritage villages. In parts of Europe, communities continue to weave linen, wool, and hemp by hand, keeping alive a chain of knowledge passed down from mother to daughter, master to apprentice. Textiles also survive in museums, where fragile fragments of cloth reveal both artistry and utility. Worn robes, altar cloths, and embroidered banners tell stories of devotion, power, and daily survival. Each piece, though faded, carries the fingerprints of its weaver and the rhythms of an age when fabric was as valuable as coin. Modern artisans and historians often turn back to these medieval methods, not simply for nostalgia but for their unique qualities. Hand-woven fabric breathes differently, holds warmth in distinctive ways, and bears the irregularities that remind us of human presence. These imperfections are not flaws, but signatures of life and labour. The story of medieval weaving is not merely about cloth, it is about connection. Threads bound together families, villages, and nations. They clothed kings and shepherds alike, and their making demanded patience, cooperation, and resilience. By remembering and preserving these traditions, we honour not only the fabrics, but also the countless unnamed weavers who, with wooden looms and calloused hands, clothed the medieval world.